I would like to say, classic punk time. Let's at least give to like 8:05. See what's happening. this feels like the perfect time to jump in. Hi, everyone. It's Rock and Roll High School number 4. This week, we have Martin talking about a non-Punisher view on power violence. I believe that Sam is going to perhaps skip for tonight. And then we're going to have a workshop with Rhiannon. So if anything, we're going to start with Martin now. But as always, housekeeping. I am going to say I keep recording all of these lectures. So if you don't feel comfortable being recorded, please turn your camera off, turn your mic off. If you have any further problems, just contact me about it. However, aside from that, without further ado, Martin, I really want to hear about power violence.
Okay, thanks, Sasha. It sounds like I have extra time, so should I just do the Punisher overview? Is that okay? Cool.
Go for it.
I'm just joking, everybody. Give me a second here to get my tab loaded up. Okay. Here we go. Did it work? Can you see my screen? Great. All right, everybody, welcome. Here's a good meme to start us off. Very appropriate. So here's today's program. Just a quick overview of what we'll be doing. I'm not going to read all of this, but that's the order of events. And a quick introduction. So thanks to Sasha for putting together this Rock and Roll High School and for inviting me. Thanks everyone for coming. Little background on me, if you don't know me, I'm Martin, and I played in a power violence band, Violent Intent, from 2008 to active until 2016, and we did lots of tours and records. I'm not a record collector, so not a record nerd, not a timeline nerd, so hopefully this won't be a Punisher overview, but the caveat is that power violence is a very punishing genre, so buckle up. It's going to be a little bit punishing no matter what, but I tried my best. Okay, so first things first, we're going to talk about the genre definition. So power violence, it's both a very stupid and wonderful genre. So this is the genre definition that I'm going to give. This is kind of my opinion, my definition. This is based on like what I think the definitive bands sound like, oral histories of people who were there at the time, what they were influenced by, my own taste. I think a genre definition is important just to give you like what is the definitive characteristics of power violence. So timeline stuff we'll talk about, but it originated in California in the late 80s and 90s. And it was a combination of sounds that were happening at the time in metal and punk. So the fast parts of hardcore punk and the slow sludge breakdowns of metal. And it was the synergy of those two things and the contrast between them. The fastest of the fast, the slowest of the slow, that gave us power balance. Other notable things are there's punk style drumming. So the drumming is very like kind of pots and pans, not super technical metal, grindcore drumming, not a lot of double kick. Lots of sudden extreme tempo shifts, but not in a like mathy way. So not in a like super mathematical, like off time signature way. And fuck math, thank you misery. The very DIY approach, so shows, releases, you know, a lot of basement shows, DIY venues, DIY record zines, like very DIY. Politically aware lyrics, obviously, and the vocal style, very raw, like natural yelling and shouting. And you're thinking of course, the cave person power violence vocals. So let's talk about what power violence is not. Just to define it from some other genres that were around at the time. So we have, you know, grindcore, right? Which a lot of people might confuse with power violence. It's also very fast and has slow parts, but grindcore has metal style drumming. It's very technical. It usually doesn't come from as much of a DIY background. It's more in like the metal scene, which is more produced, you know, has like barcodes on CDs and record labels and that kind of stuff. The vocal style is also very technical, very practiced, right? It's like guttural growls and screams and stuff that you have to like really practice to do, versus power balance is just yelling. It's just yelling. And again, the guitars and drums and stuff are going to be very well-produced metal style production. Another genre that you saw at the time was crossover thrash emerging, kind of around the same time as power balance. And that's a similar combination, which is really interesting, where it's metal and punk as well, but really it was the fast parts of metal and the slow parts from punk. So maybe someone could look into that. I just kind of thought of that while doing this. Never had occurred to me before, but crossover thrash is really kind of a polar opposite to power balance, maybe. I don't know. Okay, moving on. So important song. This is just a song that was written by a band called Man is the Bastard, which we're going to talk about later. But this is a song that they wrote, which is kind of important for what power balance is. So it's called HSMP, Hispanic Small Man Power. And the song is based on something that happened to them at a show, an early show in the power balance scene. There's lots of stories from the show. It's like everyone has their own anecdote about it. But basically there was a lot of like violence and kind of a vibe in the crowd, and the titular Hispanic man of the song, who was just a bar regular hanging out, right? A bit of an outsider to the scene. He just kind of like came in and grabbed the mic and made a little speech that just like was really talking about unifying everybody and how everyone should just be friends and we're all the same, on the same team. And that just like pacified the crowd, and it just unified everybody. And they wrote the song about it. Anyways, in the song, they shout out West Coast power balance, which is the first time the word power balance, the genre name, was like written into the public record, so to speak, and listed these bands, crossed out No Comment, Man Pig, Capitalist Casualties, and Man is the Bastard. So those are kind of the like canonical power balance bands from this West Coast power balance first wave, which we're going to talk about. Just a quick note, any of you who are a little bit aware of power balance maybe have heard of all these bands except for Man Pig. Who's Man Pig? Man Pig is basically just Infest. Infest had broken up, became Man Pig. But that's a Punisher note. We will leave that for now. So moving on, here's all the bands that were shouted out there. So this is just some cover art from the period of those bands. And next, a quick note on power violence as a word. What's the right way to write it? Power balance with no space, power balance with a space, or with a dash? Well, power balance with no space, that's the technically correct way. That's preferred. Sometimes power space violence is okay. Power dash violence is not okay. That's not appropriate. I mean, I know this is punishing, but you have to, because which one is it? You never know. I don't know. I have to look it up every time. Okay. So let's go to origins and early history. This is a photo of the singer of Infest, Joe D'Annunzio, from 1987. Okay, so before power balance, there's proto-power balance. So like, where did it come from? What were the bands kind of making these sounds before power balance really came up? So lots of mid-'80s hardcore and punk were playing faster and faster, pushing kind of the speed limit of punk without getting into like this technical metal style drumming, and experimenting with slower or sludgier parts mixed in. So everyone cites Siege, and often they're lumped in with power balance, but they're not a power balance band. They were playing in DC slightly before. It's a totally different part of the country. I haven't even been able to find any like evidence that the people who started the first power balance bands had actually heard Siege first. More like the zeitgeist of punk music at the time had lots of bands that were playing faster and faster, pushing this envelope, and Siege was kind of like a parallel evolution of the sound. And they just had one release. Other bands that are notable, Impact Unit from Massachusetts, they're just funny because the Mighty Mighty Bosstones singer was the singer in that band. Everybody knows Negative Approach, Alarm from the Netherlands are often also cited. So they're just some important, the Scada Power Balance pipeline is real. I didn't do a slide on that though. So this is just the prehistory that we have to address, but let's get to the real shit. So Infest, formed in Valencia, California. That's basically LA County, 1986. This is the cover of Slave that came out in 1988, which was their first EP. They had a demo before that. And this was really like fast hardcore, sludgy breakdown parts, very Youth Crew influenced. compared to other faster hardcore bands playing at the time. They really brought in like a youth crew, I don't know, like tough guy influence. This is like 80s youth crew, right? And this is really where that first wave kicks off, the West Coast power bounce. So all these bands are California, and they're all kind of the same small scene. Here's a clip that hopefully will work of Infest playing in 1990. So if you've never heard power bounce before, this is going to give you a little twist, a little taste, sorry. And yeah, here we go. Wasn't that great? Okay. So after Infest, let's go to Neanderthal. So the Infest guitarist, Matt Domino, he linked up with this guy, Eric Wood, who we're going to hear about, who was in some other like, you know, pre-Power Balance bands. And they formed Neanderthal in 1989. And they released this EP, Fighting Music, which really pushed it outside of this like straightforward, you know, Infest is just like very like hardcore fast part, slow part, yelling. That's it, you know. Neanderthal has like weird sludge parts, like tortured screaming vocals, like all kinds of weird stuff. Because Eric Wood's a weirdo. But this is really where things happen. And what's important for them is that they came up with the term power balance. So this was a jam. This is like a quote from Eric Wood. Where they're just hanging out at practice trying to think of like, what are we going to call this music? What's our scene called? What's our genre? And Matt Domino, the guitarist from Infest, just said fucking power balance. And that's what stuck, power balance. So this is where the genre name came from. Everyone's talking about Eric Wood in the chat. I tried to get Taylor Geddes to give me a good Eric Wood quote for a presentation, but he didn't have anything great. I'm trying not to talk about him too much because that's where we get into real Punisher territory. But we're going to talk about Eric Wood right now with his band, Man is the Bastard. So Neanderthal just did that one release. That was kind of it. And Man is the Bastard is one of these bands. They're the ones who wrote that song, HSMP, that I talked about earlier. And this is this guy, Eric Wood. So he's kind of like a hippie, grinder, noise freak, bass guy. He just keeps playing music. He's still playing music today. Man is the Bastard is like the first band. Very proggy bass parts, rotating members, lots of different splits and releases, lots of incorporation of noise, more experimental elements, and a mix of like hippie-esque politics, so like pro-animal, pro-feminist, like pro-unity hippie vibes, but then brutal music and imagery. So Eric Wood's quote, mellow human, ultra megaton, brutal music. So you have to talk about Man is the Bastard because he's just kept going, and Eric Wood is like online typing in all caps with skull emojis. Yeah, Sameio is literally giving a good example. So, but we're not going to talk too much more about him. So another early important band is No Comment from North Hollywood. So it's similar gestation time to Infest, hardcore blasting fast parts, but less of the youth crew influence. The downsided 7-inch that came out in 1992 is considered like a really influential 7-inch, and all the music I'm talking about is on a playlist that I'll share later. So if you're like, don't write down band names, you can just listen to the playlist later. The singer in this band also went on to do Man is the Bastard with Eric Wood. I'm mostly just mentioning them because they're just important as one of those bands, and their music is really good. So next we're gonna go to my favorites, or one of my favorites, Crossed Out. So this is kind of like Infest has done their demo, released it, No Comments kind of buzzing around, and then new bands are starting. Man is the Bastard starts, Crossed Out starts in San Diego. So they're really stripped down, lo-fi recordings, very, very simple riffs, very fast, very, very simple, very slow parts, very smashing breakdowns, very influential. Eric Wood did play bass at the end of the band for their last couple shows, and maybe a recording or two. And here's a clip. Okay, yeah, I know the video is not great. Hopefully you got the impression. Anyways, just to give you a taste. Okay, here's a quote from the singer of Crossed Out from that show. Fuck grindcore. So just to make clear that they're different genres. That's just what I'm pointing at here. That's all. Okay, now we're going to take a quick break and talk about hair care. I know it seems a bit strange, but hair care is always important. So the singer of Crossed Out actually went on to become the CEO of Ovation and Equus, which are two shampoo companies for humans and non-human animals, respectively. He's still punk. Quote, I still spin my man as the bastard 7 inches. And I just think it's really funny that this is what he does now. So here's a video of him talking about his business.
I didn't have the concept that Voodoo brought of constant contact, going back and reaching out to the customers, informing them, detailing them, and getting them to come back to the website, both for new business and for reorders. You get some people that come to the site and don't order, they go somewhere else. You got some people that come to the site, they buy, and they forget to reorder, or they just don't ever get around to it. By being able to stay in touch with them.
Okay, Dallas, when are we going to get that Crossed Out reunion? Okay, so now we're going to talk about Slap a Ham. So all these bands are playing, but Chris Dodge started Slap a Ham Records and really put out most of the releases of these bands that got wide distribution. So just very important. Don't really have much to say about them except for that. This is just a label that put out a lot of these records. And he formed Spaz after around this time. We'll talk about them later. And he hosted a festival, which was kind of the showcase for the label, Slap a Ham. It was called Fiesta Grande. And the early instances of that fest were a lot of power violence bands and kind of were like the big power violence shows that brought the scene together at the time. And I think I have some of the, here's some of the early releases. So we have the Crossed Out Man is the Bastard Split. That's number 14. Slap a Ham number 1 is Infest. The Downsided No Comment record I mentioned earlier. Capitalist Casualties. So Slap a Ham. And here's some of the flyers from the first and second Fiesta Grande, just to give you an idea. I see we have Taylor and Antoine here. Are you guys at Jam right now? Let me know in the chat. Yeah, look, Jeff, I'm not going to talk about No Use for a Name. Like, we could be here all day talking about who was in what bands. Like, let's just keep the background facts out of it. Okay. So 1993, that's the first Fiesta Grande. We just saw the flyer. Crossed Out, that's their last show. Infest is already broken up. No Comment is already basically broken up. Man is the Bastard and Capitalist Casualties basically play forever. Like, they just keep playing in one form or another. But for all those first wave bands, they're done. None of them have toured at all, really, except in California to play for each other. And they've started putting out releases with Slap a Ham. So this is where like kind of the second wave of stuff happens. And there's no like clear cutoff, but I'm just, all the first wave bands are kind of done or have like morphed into their eternal form. And the genre is spreading from influence of like people hearing these records. So we're going to talk about those bands. Of course, it starts in California, obviously. So we see bands like Spaz that starts in the Bay Area. Despise You in Inglewood. There's Charles Bronson in Illinois. DeKalb, I don't know how to say it, near Chicago. Apartment 213 in Cleveland, Lack of Interest in LA. And there's bands like in other places, right, that are taking power violence already and like mixing with other things. So like Drop Dead is kind of mixing power violence and like crust punk hardcore a bit more. Crom is more like a metal band, but bringing in some power violence influences and playing with power violence bands and doing splits with power violence bands. So this is kind of like second wave start, just kind of name checking bands. We'll talk about Spaz and Charles Bronson. So this is second wave. So these are also interesting because they brought in, Spaz and Charles Bronson specifically brought in like a less self-serious, more humorous spirit to power violence. A lot more like jokes and in-jokes and like funny lyrics or like humorous lyrics. And both bands were very prolific in that they toured, right? I couldn't find the chart, Sasha. I'm sorry, but we're going to talk about it later. So, yeah, Spaz, again, Chris Dodge's band. Lots of samples from movies, pop culture, joke songs, lighthearted humor, in-jokes, like novelty releases. They did like a toy record that you needed like a toy record player to play, and like tiny 5-inch records and all, that kind of stuff. And then Charles Bronson, kind of on the other end of the humor spectrum, kind of like an art school teenager band, a lot of satirical and ironic humor, pretentious, but also like self-deprecating. Anyways, so these bands kind of brought in that sensibility to things, and also toured a lot more, at least a little bit, and did lots of releases, or at least got more distribution while they were active. So this is part of like an influence happening, which is important later for sure. Also, like by the late 90s, basically we're seeing that the genre has just like morphed and is getting mixed up with all kinds of other things. So we have like blank violence, right? There's like emo violence, which is like screamo and power violence. There's like grind violence, which is grindcore and power violence. So just grindcore and grind, like all these things. This is the Inhumanity record, which kind of like came up with the term emo violence, I think, or dubbed themselves that. Orchid is sometimes thought of as like an emo violence band. So this is kind of like the late 90s, like power violence has like spread out and been like mixed up with all these other genres. There's a lot of international bands. There's Hell Nation from Japan, like a fastcore power violence band. I can't get into all of that, right? Beyond the scope of the presentation. But at this point, it's a thing. It's so much of a thing that it's become parts of other things. So what happens next? There's a resurgence. So starting in the mid-2000s and rising after that, we start to see this continuous influence and bubbling of power violence, kind of reaching a peak with many, many more bands identifying as power violence or being labeled as power violence. There's too many bands to name in this period, so talking about the early 2000s onward, I'm not going to name every single band. There's like hundreds and hundreds of bands. So I'm just going to do some signposts that I think are important in the genre's progression and movement. Okay, so one important thing that happened is that No Man's Slave released a record, even though they were broken up in 2002. So this was a 1995 recording session, and the vocals were recorded in 2000, and then it was released in 2002, No Man's Slave. And for some people, sometimes me on the right day, this is like the best Infest release. And it definitely hit at a time and just like renewed interest in power violence, and also like brought back like, this is what the first band sounded like. And they're doing basically the same. Like they didn't sound super different. The recording was a little bit different produced maybe, but it wasn't like now they're a goth band or something. So, oh my God, West Coast people want to talk about what happens next. All right. Listen, I can't have every band in the presentation. So No Man's Slave comes out. That's important. Great record. And a lot of hardcore in the early mid 2000s is influenced by power violence, or is just their first demo is a power violence demo. And then they become a different band after that. They just become a hardcore band, or become a mid-tempo, like boring hardcore band, or a power violence influenced hardcore band maybe. So Think I Care, they're like a Boston kind of tough guy band, mid-tempo. Their first EP is just a power violence record. Ceremony's first EP demo is arguably power violence, and this is what they look like now. They're like a new wave goth band. I don't even remember what they sound like. And here's a flyer when Ceremony played Montreal in 2007. That was Violent Ten's first show. That's just a little piece of history there. Trash Talk, for example, their first demo was power violence, and I'm not even sure what they're doing now. Like all kinds of things. Weekend Nachos, terrible, mediocre hardcore band, and their demo is like a power violence. And people called them power violence through their whole career, even though they just basically dropped that sound right away. So one good signpost in this period that comes out of kind of all that stuff is Mind Eraser. So this came out of the Boston hardcore scene. People who were in Boston hardcore bands, some of the bands that I've mentioned, or peripheral to those bands. But they were very much more like a power violence project. They kind of brought back the self-serious, hardcore influenced approach to power violence. They were like named like Mind Eraser's a Neanderthal song, and named after a Neanderthal song. A lot of overlap with hardcore, and that they played hardcore shows a lot. And I think that really brought a lot more of the serious power violence influence back. I mean, they toured and played a lot. So this is like a good signpost for me. The other thing that's happening at this time is pizza violence, right? This is what I was talking about earlier with Spaz, the legacy of Spaz and Charles Bronson. Now, don't get me wrong, Spaz and Charles Bronson are great bands. They're excellent. And they did the humor very well. But something that happened is a lot of bands, especially in this period, were identifying or just labeled as power violence. But for them, all power violence meant was it was just a band with fast music and short songs and joke lyrics. And that meant you were a power violence band, which is really unfortunate, in my opinion. And some characteristics of these bands, right? The lyrics are about pizza, beer, parties, beer bonging through a pizza at a party, etc. Closer to grindcore, I mean, there's also a parallel pizza grind, genre. Bands that have pizza, burger, nachos in the name. Maybe talked about some of those already. Lots of white dreads, excessively long joke song names, which is a holdover from Charles Bronson. Again, not trash talking Charles Bronson. Again, also the band name is just an actor or character's name. These are all the hallmarks of pizza violence. Taylor, you're reading ahead. Taylor Geddes. So here's some quotes from Andy Nolan from Endless Blockade. Kind of like he was in a band that did a lot of power violence and toured a lot. And I take his opinion. So here's what he's saying about, if you want to look at what power violence is, you can't just take Eric Wood's word on the subject because he'll say anything's power violence. Or look at your local sloppy blast beat and Wheat screaming about pizza and circle pit bands. And then he's talking about circus grind and pizza party power violence. So this is a phenomenon that's happening at this time. But there's still hope. Neo power violence. Sorry, I'm just getting my notes here. So I already talked about Mind Eraser, which is definitely an important band, and they started quite early, 2004. And as I covered, there were lots of bands in the early mid 2000s starting up playing different kinds of music that was being called power violence. And I want to talk about 3 bands that started in the early 2000s that released LPs in the mid to late 2000s that were all very definitive for neo power violence, cementing this newer form that was still connected to original power violence in sound and spirit, but brought in influences and more complex songwriting or mature songwriting, but without making it into grindcore / power violence or hardcore / power violence or whatever. This is why it became a new thing on its own, neo power violence. So these were all bands that had members who played in other power violence bands first. They'd done a couple little projects and then they kind of refined themselves, started new projects, got into these bands, and then released these 3 LPs basically in a row that really was the summit of this resurgence and the peak of this neo power violence genre. So first in 2007, Iron Lung releases Sexless No Sex, and they're a 2-piece from Seattle. The guitarist was in Gob, the power violence Gob, which was actually playing around the 90-95 period. Big contrast of fast and slow music, shouting vocals, but the guitar and drum is complex playing, but the parts aren't complex. Anyways, it's a great record. The next one, 2008, Toronto's The Endless Blockade releases Primitive. Jay points out that, yeah, these are all 45 RPM LPs, but they're still LPs. Endless Blockade is more metal side drumming, but I mean, high-pitched vocals, traditional PV caveman yells, lots of noise incorporated, noise music, harsh noise. And then 2009, Hatred Surge Deconstruct, which is from Austin, 2 vocalists, a little bit of grind influence, but still not grindcore, still it's power violence. So these 3 records all came out in quick succession and really just marked that power violence could become a new thing, this neo power violence. I mean, these bands were touring, they were playing tons of shows, playing together. So this is what I'm talking about with neo-power-violence, and it really helped like clear out a lot of the garbage, a lot of the pizza out of the genre, where you could look up what is power violence now, and you'd see like, okay, Iron Lung, Hatred Surge, Endless Blockade. They're playing, they're touring. They don't sound exactly like old power violence. They're not just like genre ripoffs of Crossed Out. They're doing something new, but it's still power violence. Okay, and this golden age, I mean, I'm going to show you some flyers. Like, these are all flyers I had on my computer. They're shows that Violent Tent played. But just to kind of give you a taste of like 2010 to 2015, there were shows like this, right? Which is kind of like all these bands playing together. This was Not Dead Yet in 2012. So you have Vaccine from Massachusetts, Purity Control from Toronto, Column of Heaven, which is Endless Blockade. We had the Rita, Gas Chamber from Buffalo, Despise You's Reunion Tour. Okay, so just a little bit of, here's a great show, Iron Lung playing at Death Church with Column of Heaven again, Violent Tent, and Shit. So just playing with best bands playing at the time, like Shit, are playing with these neo-power violence bands, like all at once. So where does this bring us? Where are we going? Where are we going now? Certainly this resurgence has tapered off. Those bands have like evolved into other things or broken up. Where are we doing now? So one thing I want to talk about is death metal theory. So many bands in the power violence resurgence that I've just been talking about either evolved into just playing death metal, or their band members went on to be in death metal bands or death metal adjacent type bands. I don't know why, but it's a thing. Here's a list of the bands where this happened. So Endless Blockade did Slaughter Strike, which was a metal band, Column of Heaven, which was much more metal influenced. Bleeding Out's a current band that's death grind. Later Mind Eraser is basically just almost death metal. And the singer started Innumerable Forms with Jensen from Iron Lung. Also Lifeless Dark is the guitarist from Mind Eraser, and they're like a sacrilege style, I don't know, crossover punk metal band. Later Hatred Surge is much more death metal, and there's a lot of crossover with members and songwriting with Mammoth Grinder, which is a metal band. Purity Control from Toronto is Tomb Mold now, which is wild. Subsist, Getty's in the chat, started Profane Order, which is war metal. That's death metal adjacent, right? Anna from Vancouver was a power violence band, and later Anna they're just a death metal and metal adjacent band. So that's a quick thing I wanted to say. But the present, I mean, there's still good power violence bands working today, right? We have, considering what a small, like geographically local genre it was, there's still bands all the way out now that are great. So we got, I think Healer is from California, if I'm not mistaken. And then Reek Minds just came out on 11 PM Records. I just got it recently. Woundman and Regional Justice Center are both playing and doing recordings. Regional Justice Center a lot. They just released an LP like last week. And that's it. So these are my acknowledgements. So thanks a lot to my bandmates in Violent Tent who went on this power violence journey with me for many years, Jay, Brant, and Hans. I obviously referenced Andy Nolan's blog. Taylor Geddes helped me a little bit with some fact checking and sharing some resources. I have never used Discogs more in my life than I did for this. This link is a good oral history of power violence. That's actually one of the better resources. Power Violence Project zine. A lot of the good black and white photos are from Angela Owens, and Taylor, my partner, helped me practice and gave me some feedback. And of course, thank you to Sasha and everybody here for sitting through my talk. I look forward to the next talk. That's it. How do I end? Stop. Okay.
That was so sick. I love that. That was absolutely a non-Punisher overview. I love how everyone was also digging into it. I feel like there are so many other things that everyone wants to talk about power violence and offshoots of power violence, but you know, there's only so many hours in the day. So as for now, I have been told that Rhiannon cannot run a workshop, and I am wondering if. Wait, I'm gonna put on a music video, and I'm gonna figure one thing out. I'll be back in three minutes.
I'm here.
Okay. Do you want to put the video on?
I can if you want.
Okay. Yes.
I
That's
mean,
exactly.
everybody
I
can
wasn't
print
gonna
at
put
it.
you on the spot. I was just gonna be like, "Can I put the video on?"
I mean, the video's been done. It's just, yeah. I mean, I can put it on if you want.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Rhiannon is not going to do a workshop tonight.
Okay.
We just can't make it. But Sameio is going to put on a very sick video about Japanese rock punk.
Wait, I can't find it. Oh, fuck, my hard drive's not plugged in. Okay, give me like 30 seconds.
Do you want me? I'm just going to put on a very short video.
Okay, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
This video is literally in my phone.
I'll put something else on.
No, you can wait. I'm like, I got my hard drive. I'm good. I have to find the file. But
Okay. Sorry.
I don't know what you're apologizing for. We're all fine and dandy. What the fuck happened to this? God. Okay, here, I found the file. My computer is like overheating, but yeah, we can watch this if you want.
I think that we would all like to watch Sameio's video on Japanese rock punk.
Okay. How do I make the thing work?
If you go to present now,
Okay. Is this working? Yes? Okay.
Over the past 4 decades, many of the most venerated pieces of hardcore and punk can be traced back to Japan. During the highly documented period in which the American and British hardcore scenes were erupting, concomitant movement would take place within the Japanese scene. We began in late 1970s Kyoto with the band who was widely regarded to be the harbinger of the raw, brooding hardcore sound in Japan. During the same year in which the formation of world-renowned hardcore bands such as Discharge and Bad Brains took place in the United Kingdom and the United States, a new sound was simultaneously forming in Japan. The earliest incantation of Japanese raw punk has mainly been accredited to the short-lived band SS. Although most likely having little to no knowledge of their American and British contemporaries, they took a concurrent approach to the genre. The entire recorded material of SS only amounted to 2 live recordings, which were not formally released until 1984, but the sheer magnitude of their live performances and their innovative sound was enough to birth a whole new style of Japanese punk. SS augmented the current sound of popular American and British punk into a raw, stripped-down, and vigorous sound that would inspire some of the greatest and most influential pieces of punk and hardcore in existence. Let's go! After the initial spark of SS in early 1979, a few other bands of similar cadence began to pop up in the Japanese scene within the following months. The most notable band to form in 1979 other than SS was Geotai, later to be rebranded as the Stalin. The entire recorded material of Geotai only amounted to a single demo compilation of recordings from late 1979 to early 1980, before they had some minor lineup changes and permanently rebranded themselves as the Stalin in late 1980. They were led by a 29-year-old socialist activist by the name of Michiro Endo, originally starting as a three-piece band. Due to their stellar recorded releases and their explosive live show, which also resulted in Endo receiving an indecent exposure charge after performing at a high school in 1981, the Stalin remains one of the most influential forces throughout the history of Japanese punk and hardcore, most notably with their 1982 release, Stop Jab. In early 1983, the band began to wear thin. They underwent many lineup changes, with some members only remaining for a handful of months. But as the flame of the Stalin began to fade and the band slowly fell apart, some of the most monumental records in all of hardcore history would come to fruition. 1982 to 1989 were amongst the most important years within the Japanese hardcore scene. We start by turning our hand to GISM, specifically with their debut album, Devastation. Originally formed in late 1980 and first performing at a university in Tokyo in 1981, GISM was quite revolutionary within the scene, as they were, arguably to some, the earliest Japanese band to truly blend the worlds of hardcore punk and heavy metal. GISM did this not as much in the vein of crossover thrash bands that were forming simultaneously in America, but more so in a style that was reminiscent of the new wave of British heavy metal. Although the music of GISM had a handful of aspects analogous to the characteristics of their contemporaries in the UK, they took a much more experimental and avant-garde approach than both the British heavy metal bands they would bear comparison to, as well as the domestic bands that existed prior to them. They were also known for their intense live performance, notably a 1986 gig during which their lead singer Sukebi Yokoyama brandished a homemade flamethrower on stage, firing it towards the audience while performing. Presumably, this was something that worked as a big driving force for GISM's local notoriety, as they were actively performing both before and during the same period as infamous Japanese noise acts such as Hanatarash and the Gara Gara Gegege, were mainly acclaimed for their extraordinarily dangerous and intense live shows. GISM was able to combine the best of both worlds by creating an intense live experience accompanied by much more conspicuous and accessible music. Originally formed in 1981, Gauze also remains amongst the most notable names in all of hardcore history, specifically with their debut release Fuckheads and sophomore release Equalizing Distor. Gauze took an interesting approach with their sound. They had a very tightly played yet airy recording style that carried a great sense of franticity, and it stood the test of time all the way from the formative years of the genre until present day. According to their original basis, the band's goal was to play as fast as possible, which proved to be very prevalent from their incarnation until their final recorded release in 2007. Another thing this era offered was a handful of compilation records, the first notable one being the 1982 compilation by City Rocker Records titled Outsider. City Rocker was a label that harbored many of the influential releases in prior years, including the aforementioned Gauze and the Stalin, and was very crucial to the growing movement of Japanese rock punk. The Outsider compilation was split into two sides, one entitled New Block Punk Side, and the other entitled Hard quote-unquote Metalcore Side. The latter featured the likes of GISM, Gauze, Laughing Nose, and a new band called The Comes. The Combs quickly gained notoriety after their 1983 release No Side, personal all-time favorite of mine and many others. The Combs were the first significant band in all of Japanese punk and hardcore to be fronted by a woman, and remained to be for quite some time after their formation. The harrowing, shouted vocals accompanied by the band's aggressive playing style made for a sound that was unique at the time and is still endlessly replicated to this day. The sound of the Combs once again become especially prominent in the past decade and bears many parallels to modern rock punk. Following the release of Outsider in 1982 was the Great Punk Hits compilation. Released by Japan Records in 1983, this compilation was crucial to the small amount of near-mainstream crossover traction that the scene received in its formative years. The focal reason this compilation was sought after in circles outside of the core scene is that Japan Records was not solely a punk label. They were a larger media company who would release everything from folk and blues to pop music to punk and metal, and therefore this compilation was able to showcase something new to a larger audience. This compilation featured Gizm and Laughing Nose, along with The Clay, The Execute, Aparataco, and GZ, all of which continued on to be amongst the most esteemed bands of the years to follow. Following the Great Punk Hits compilation was Hardcore and Lawful Assembly. Released by AA Records in 1984, this compilation featured many of the previously mentioned bands, along with a few other significant bands at the time, most notably Auto, Lip Cream, and Zool. Lip Cream was one of the only bands at the time to employ cover art with bright, full-color graphic design, while still maintaining the grimy, high-octane sound, and Zool has also made a huge impact in Japanese rock punk history with their EP entitled The Final Agony, which is another very highly sought-after piece of music and is considered to be one of the best and most influential releases to come out of this era. Alright, as I said in the beginning of this section, there's way too many bands to cover in depth while remaining concise, and we still have a whole nother section to tackle after this, so to avoid becoming overly repetitive, I'm going to do a bit of a speed round of noteworthy pre-disclosed / 1990 bands and releases. Kuro gained nationwide infamy after they beat up the members of a metal band called 44 Magnum solely because they all had blonde hair and were signed to a major label. This is such an oddly pivotal incident that it's still mentioned in both Kuro and 44 Magnum's Discogs biography today. This happened in 1984, the same year in which they released their monumental 8-inch EP titled Who the Helpless. Next comes a band who formed in 1984, taking their name from the second track off of Kuro's Who the Helpless EP, Human Gas. Human Gas is an interesting case because it seems like nobody is quite sure when their most important, and not to mention one of my favorite releases, Explosives, was actually put out. I've never been able to find an actual release date for the tape, and everybody I've asked, including some people who may have had some sort of kind of like deep cut research or insider info, also doesn't seem to know. There seems to be no known actual release date for Explosives, but a different version of one of the songs also appears on their 1985 split with Stalinism. So there's been an age-old argument over whether Explosives was released before this split or at some point in the following years before their breakup in 1989. Human Gas got back together after 30 years for a single reunion show in 2016.
当時のその貴重な映像を入手。高校時代に突き進んだ意外な道とは。ここに木下青年、一体どこに？まさかのパンクロック、しかもボーカル。熱き魂の叫び。
Tranquilizer was considered one of the few proto-noisecore bands, predating the aforementioned Gero Gero Gegege by just a year or two. Tranquilizer is often regarded to be the first Japanese band to intentionally make their music even more distorted than the low-quality recording equipment of the time naturally provided. Essential listening if you're a fan of vocals that sound like a kazoo. Continuing on with bands that were important to the formation of hardcore adjacent genres, SOB was considered to be one of the originators of thrashcore alongside America's Siege and Septic Death and England's electro hippies. Nowadays, SOB is considered a grindcore mainstay as they were hugely influential on grindcore bands such as Napalm Death, who they actually continued to do a split with in 1988. SOB was originally formed in 1983 and remained active up until 1995, in which they took a 3-year hiatus in wake of their original vocalist's suicide. They then returned in 1998 with Kevin Sharp of Brutal Truth on vocals, and they're still active today. I'm actually recording this and editing it in after I already did the voiceover, but I just realized that I forgot to mention LSD. I don't know what to say about them specifically. Destroy 1983. Listen to that if you want. I don't know. Other important and essential bands from this era include Deathside, Gastunk, Confused, Guy, also known as the Swankies, and the entirety of the 1987 Selfish Records compilation Thrash Till Death. This compilation featured the aforementioned Gauze, Lip Cream, and Auto alongside Systematic Death. How many fucking times am I going to say influential? In 1990, we saw the formation of one of the most influential bands throughout all of rock punk history in both a musical and cultural sense. Hailing from Kochi City, Japan, Disclose took the sound of UKD beat originators Discharge and further amplified it through use of intensified distortion and a general sense of oral barbarity. Though not being the originators of the stereotypical DV war songs, they were definitely the main band to popularize the formula with releases such as Fear of the War, Once the War Started, Visions of War, Never Ending War, and most importantly, The Aspects of War. This is one of the things that made Disclose stand out from the horde of earlier Japanese raw punk bands that we glossed over in the previous section, as many of those bands only had enough releases to be counted on half a hand, or maybe 6 deformed fingers in the case of a select few bands. Disclose had just short of 40 official releases, not including compilation records and unofficial live recordings and outtake releases. Also formed in 1991, Gloom was a quintessential band to spawn from early 90s Japan. Most noteworthy for their EP's recommendation of Perdition and speed noise hardcore rags, Gloom is considered to be one of the most important crust bands, period, as well as a band that is very much germane to what crust is today. Gloom would also go on to coin the term crasher crust, which continued on to be adopted by many bands, such as the American queercore Disclose worship that is Physique, and fellow Japanese visionaries such as Contrast Attitude and Cyanus. Although the late 90s and early 2000s were somewhat collectively barren for hardcore scenes internationally, there was still a handful of phenomenal bands to come out of Japan throughout the epoch of pre-Y2K mass hysteria through 2007 or so. Some of those bands included Declone, the criminally underrated Conka Fury, Kriegshog, Acute, Schizophrenia, and Frontu. Also, once again, I know Fremtip was actually formed in 1997, but I mean, who cares about anything before the 99 8-track EP or the 2004 Disclose split? If that is the case, I'd say I can strongly agree with your position. Disclose was the most prominent driving force throughout the entire era in which they were active and have inspired countless bands all over the globe, even in the years after their lead guitarist and vocalist Hideki Kawakami died of an accidental overdose in late 2007. Also, I made this big, listening list. Contact me if you want it. Okay, bye. Thanks for listening to me ramble.
Right, yeah, there was that.
Yes, that was amazing. I love that. I am also encouraging. I mean, you said you already made a playlist. I would encourage you to send me that playlist. I would love, Meredith is also making a playlist from next week. I would love to compile a place that I can share all of these playlists with people. Also, Martin, no pressure, but if you want to make a power violence playlist, obviously I would also put that together.
You're in the chat.
I didn't make a playlist. I just made like a big like listening list because like a bunch of the shit on it was like only on a certain service. Like some of it wasn't on YouTube, and then some of it wasn't on like SoulSeek. So it was like you kind of just have to read the list and listen to it as you go.
Current hot take is August from Physique is very humbled to have been included in this lecture series. So. Yes. Okay. So yes, I'll compile playlists. That was amazing. Everything is sick. Rhiannon cannot make it for the workshop, but it's also basically perfect timing because it's 9:07 right now. So I think now is the time that we all say good night and see you next Thursday.